we're live. Welcome to Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. This is a Southern style audiobook. I'm Jake Phillips. I am a voice actor, and in my free time, I like to read classic literature. So if that's your thing, you should subscribe. You should subscribe on YouTube, and yeah, there's a lot of stuff on there. Some I do Southern, some I do in Northern, in regular voices or in other accents, Northern accents, Russian accents, British accents, all that kind of stuff. Anywho, today is chapter 53 of 61 of Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen in a Southern accent, right? Bam. And then, yeah, you can subscribe, link down below. Okay, let us get started. Where are we at? Where's my thing? Okay. Chapter 53. Mr. Wickham was so perfectly satisfied with this conversation that he never again distressed himself or provoked his dear sister Elizabeth by introducing the subject of it, and she was pleased to find that she had said enough to keep him quiet. The day of his and Lydia's departure soon came, and Mrs. Bennet was forced to submit to a separation, which, as her husband by no means entered into her scheme of all their going to Newcastle, was likely to continue at least a 12-month. "Oh, my dear Lydia," she cried, "when shall we meet again?" "Oh, Lord, I don't know. Not these 2 or 3 years, perhaps." "Write to me very often, my dear." "As often as I can, but you know married women have never such time for writing. My sisters may write to me. They'll have nothing else to do." Mr. Wickham's adieus were much more affectionate than his wife's. He smiled, looked handsome, and said many pretty things. "He's as fine a fellow," said Mr. Bennet, as soon as they were out of the house, "as I ever saw. He simpers and smirks and makes love to us all. I'm prodigiously proud of him. I defy even Sir William Lucas himself to produce a more valuable son-in-law." The loss of her daughter made Mrs. Bennet very dull for several days. "I often think," said she, "that there's nothing so bad as parting with one's friends. One seems so forlorn without 'em. This is the consequence, you see, madam, of marrying— Oh, sorry, this is not Dad, this is Elizabeth. "This is the consequence, you see, madam, of marrying a daughter," said Elizabeth. "It must make you better satisfied that your other 4 are single." "It's no such thing. Lydia does not leave me because she's married, but only because her husband's regiment happened to be so far off. If it had been nearer, she would not have gone so soon." But the spiritless condition which this event threw her into was shortly relieved, and her mind opened again to the agitation of hope by an article of news which then began to be in circulation. The housekeeper at Netherfield had received orders to prepare for the arrival of her master, who was coming down in a day or two to shoot there for several weeks. Mrs. Bennet was quite in the fidgets. She looked at Jane and smiled and shook her head by turns. "Well, well, and so Mr. Bingley's coming down, sister," for Mrs. Phillips first brought her the news. "Well, so much the better. Not that I care about it, though. He's nothing to us, you know, and I'm sure I never want to see him again. But, however, he is very welcome to come to Netherfield if he likes it, and who knows what may happen. But that's nothing to us. You know, sister, we agreed long ago never to mention a word about it. And so it's often certain he's coming? And so it's quite certain he's coming?" "You may depend on it," replied the other, "for Mrs. Nichols was in Meryton last night, and I saw her passing by, and went out myself on purpose to know the truth of it, and she told me that it was certain true. He comes down on Thursday at the latest, very likely on Wednesday. She was going to the butcher's, she told me on purpose, to order in some meat on Wednesday, and she has got three couple of ducks which just fit to be killed." Miss Bennet had not been able to hear of his coming without changing color. It was many months since she had mentioned his name to Elizabeth, but now, as soon as they were alone together, she said, I saw you look at me today, Lizzie, when my aunt told us of the present report, and I know I appeared distressed, but don't imagine it was from any silly cause. I was only confused for the moment because I felt that I should be looked at. I do assure you that the news does not affect me either with pleasure or pain. I'm glad of one thing, that he comes alone, because we shall see less of him. Not that I'm afraid of myself, but I dread other people's remarks. Elizabeth did not know what to make of it. Had she not seen him in Derbyshire, she might have supposed him capable of coming there with no other view than what was acknowledged, but she still thought him partial to Jane, and she wavered as to the greater probability of his coming there with his friend's permission, or being bold enough to come without it. Yet it's hard, she sometimes thought, that this poor man cannot come to a house which he has legally hired without raising all this speculation. I'll leave him to himself. In spite of what her sister declared and really believed to be her feelings in the expectation of his arrival, Elizabeth could easily perceive that her spirits were affected by it. They were more disturbed, more unequal than she had often seen them. The subject, which had been so warmly canvassed between their parents about a 12-month ago, was now brought forward again. "As soon as ever Mr. Bingley comes, my dear," said Mrs. Bennet, "you wait on him, of course." Oh, okay, Mr. Bennet. Sometimes Jane Austen doesn't tell you who said what, and you sort of have to look at the context. So I think this is Mr. Bennet. No, no, you forced me into visiting him last year, and I promised if I went to see him, he should marry one of my daughters. But it ended in nothing, and I'll not be sent on a fool's errand again. His wife represented to him how absolutely necessary such an attention would be from all the neighboring gentlemen on his return into Netherfield. "'Tis an etiquette I despise," said he. "If he wants our society, let him seek it. He knows where we live. I'll not spend my hours in running after my neighbors every time they go away and come back again." "Well, all I know is that it will be abominably rude if you do not wait on him. But, however, that shan't prevent my asking him to dine here. I'm determined we must have Mrs. Long and the Goldens soon. That'll make 13 with ourselves, so there'll be just room at the table for him." Consoled by this resolution, she was the better able to bear her husband's incivility, though it was now very mortifying to know that her neighbors might all see Mr. Bingley in consequence of it before they did. As the day of his arrival drew near, uh, I begin to be sorry. I begin to be sorry that he comes at all," said Jane to her sister. It would be nothing. It would be nothing. I would see him with perfect indifference, but I can hardly bear to hear it thus perpetually talked of. My mother means well, but she does not know. No one can know how much I suffer from what she says. Happy shall I be when his stay at Netherfield is over. I wish I could. I wish I could say anything to comfort you," replied Elizabeth, "but it's wholly out of my power. You must feel it, and the usual satisfaction of preaching patience to a sufferer is denied me because you always because you have always so much." Mr. Bingley arrived. Mrs. Bennet, through the assistance of servants, contrived to have the earliest tidings of it, that the period of anxiety and fretfulness on her side might be as long as it could. She counted the days that must intervene before their invitation could be sent, hopeless of seeing him before. But on the third morning after his arrival in Hertfordshire, she saw him, from her dressing-room window, enter the paddock and ride towards the sorry, enter the paddock and ride towards the house. Her daughters were eagerly called to partake of her joy. Jane resolutely kept her place at the table, but Elizabeth, to satisfy her mother, went to the window. She looked. She saw Mr. Darcy with him, and sat down again by her sister. "There's a gentleman with him, mamma," said Kitty. "Who can it be?" "Some acquaintance or other, my dear, I suppose. I'm not sure I know." "Ha!" replied Kitty. "It looks just like that man that used to be with him before, Mr. What's his name? That tall, proud man." "Good gracious, Mr. Darcy! And so it does. I vow, well, Any friend of Mr. Bingley's will always be welcome here, to be sure, else I must say, else I must say that I hate the very sight of him." Jane looked at Elizabeth with surprise and concern, but she knew little of their meeting in Derbyshire, and therefore felt for the awkwardness which must attend her sister in seeing him almost for the first time after receiving his explanatory letter. Both sisters were uncomfortable enough. Each felt for the other, and of course for themselves. And their mother talked on of her dislike of Mr. Darcy and her resolution to be civil to him only as Mr. Bingley's friend, without being heard by either of them. But Elizabeth had sources of uneasiness which could not be suspected by Jane, to whom she had never yet courage to show Mrs. Gardner's letter, or to relate her own change of sentiment towards him. To Jane, he could be only a man whose proposals she had refused, and whose merit she had undervalued. But to her own more extensive information, he was the person to whom the whole family were indebted for the first of he was the person to whom the whole family were indebted for the first of benefits, and whom she regarded herself with an interest, if not quite so tender, at least as reasonable and as just as what Jane felt for Bingley. Her astonishment at his coming to Netherfield, to Longbourn, and voluntarily seeking her again, was almost equal to what she had known on first witnessing his altered behavior in Derbyshire. The color which had been driven from her face returned for half a minute with an additional glow, and a smile of delight added lustre to her eyes, as she thought for that space of time that his affection and wishes must still be unshaken. But she would not be secure. "Let me first see how he behaves," said she. "It will then be early enough for expectation." She sat intently at work, striving to be composed, and without daring to lift up her eyes, till anxious curiosity carried them to the face of her sister as the servant was approaching the door. Jane looked a little paler than usual, but more sedate than Elizabeth had expected. On the gentleman's appearing, her color increased. Yet she received him with tolerable ease, and with a propriety of behavior equally free from any symptom of resentment or any unnecessary complaisance. Elizabeth said as little to either as civilly would allow, and sat down again to her work with an eagerness which it did not often command. She had ventured only one glance at Darcy. He looked serious, as usual, and she thought more as he had been used to look in Hertfordshire than she had seen him at Pemberley. But perhaps he could not in her mother's presence be what he was before her uncle and aunt. It was a painful but not improbable conjecture. Bingley she had likewise seen for an instant, and in that short period saw him looking both pleased and embarrassed. He was received by Mrs. Bennet with a degree of civility which made her two daughters ashamed, especially when contrasted with the cold and ceremonious politeness of her curtsy and address to his friend. Elizabeth, particularly, who knew that her mother owed to the latter the preservation of her favorite daughter from Elizabeth, particularly, who knew that her mother owed to the latter the preservation of her favorite daughter from irremediable infamy, was hurt and distressed to a most painful degree by a distinction so ill applied. Darcy, after inquiring of her how Mr. and Mrs. Gardner did, a question which she could not answer without confusion, said scarcely anything. He was not seated by her. Perhaps that was the reason of his silence. But it had not been so in Derbyshire. There he had talked to her friends when he could not to herself. But now several minutes elapsed without bringing the sound of his voice, and when occasionally, unable to resist the impulse of curiosity, she raised her eyes to his face, she as often found him looking at Jane as at herself, and frequently on no object but the ground. More thoughtfulness and less anxiety to please than when they last met were plainly expressed. She was disappointed and angry with herself for being so. Could I expect it to be otherwise? Said she. Yet why did he come? She was in no humor for conversation with anyone but herself, and to him she had hardly courage to speak. She inquired after his sister, but could do no more. "It's a long time, Mr. Bingley. It's a long time, Mr. Bingley, since you went away," said Mrs. Bennet. He readily agreed to it. I began to be afraid uh, I began to be afraid you'd never come back. People did say you meant to quit the place entirely at Michaelmas, but however, I hope it's not true. A great many changes have happened in the neighborhood since you went away. Miss Lucas is married and settled, and one of my own daughters. I suppose you've heard of it. Indeed, you must have seen it in the papers. It was in the Times and the Courier. I know, though it was not put as it ought to be. Though it was not put as it ought to be. It only said lately, Mr. Wickham. It was only said lately, George Wickham, Esquire, to Miss Lydia Bennet, without there being a syllable said of her father or the place where she lived or anything. It was my brother Gardner's drawing up too, and I wonder how he came to make it such an awkward business. Did you see it? Bingley replied that he did, and made his congratulations. Elizabeth dared not lift up her eyes. How Mr. Darcy looked, therefore, she could not tell. "It was a delightful thing, to be sure, to have a daughter well married," continued her mother. "But at the same time, Mr. Bingley, it's very hard to have her taken away from me. They're gone down to Newcastle, a place quite northward, it seems, and they are there to stay I don't know how long. His regiment's there, for I suppose you've heard of his leaving the militia and of his being gone to the regulars. Thank heaven he has some friends, though perhaps not so many as he deserves." Elizabeth, who knew this to be levelled at Mr. Darcy, was in such misery of shame that she could hardly keep her seat. It drew from her, however, the exertion of speaking, which nothing else had so effectually done before, and she asked Bingley whether he meant to make any stay in the country at present. A few weeks, he believed. "When you've killed all your own birds, Mr. Bingley," said her mother, "I beg you'll come here and shoot as many as you please on Mr. Bennet's manor. I'm sure he'll be vastly happy to oblige you, and will save the best of the coveys for you." Elizabeth's misery increased at such unnecessary, such officious attention. Were the same fair prospect to arise at present as she had flattered them a year ago, everything, she was persuaded, would be hastening to the same vexatious conclusion. At that instant she felt that years of happiness could not make Jane or herself amends for moments of such painful confusion. "The first wish in my heart," oh, that's Elizabeth, it's not Miss Bennet. "The first wish in my heart," said she to herself, "is to be more in company with either of them. Is never more to be in company with either of them. Their society can afford no pleasure that will atone for such wretchedness as this. Let me never see either one or the other again." Yet the misery, for which years of happiness were to offer no compensation, received soon afterwards material relief from observing how much beauty of her sister rekindled the admiration of her former lover. When he first came in, he had spoken to her but little, but every 5 minutes seemed to be giving her more of his attention. He found her as handsome as she had been last year, as good-natured, and as unaffected, though not quite as chatty. Jane was anxious that no difference should be perceived in her at all, and was really persuaded that she talked as much as ever, but her mind was so busily engaged that she did not always know when she was silent. When the gentlemen rose to go away, Mrs. Bennet was mindful of her intended civility, and they were invited and engaged to dine at Longbourn in a few days' time. "You are quite a visit in my debt, Mr. Bingley," she added, "for when you went to town last winter you promised to take a family dinner with us as soon as you returned. I have not forgot, you see, and I assure you I was very much disappointed that you did not come back and keep your engagement." Bingley looked a little silly at this reflection, and said something of his concern at having been prevented by business. Then they went away. Mrs. Mrs. Bennet had been strongly inclined to ask them to stay and dine there that day, but though she always kept a very good table, she did not think anything less than 2 courses could be good enough for a man on whom she had such anxious designs, or satisfy the appetite and pride of one who had 10,000 a year. So that is chapter 53. Let's head into the comments real quick. Say hello. Mariah, what's going on? Mrs. Bennet makes me laugh as well. I like her and Lydia they're a couple of favorites. And Mr. Collins, probably my favorite ones to read. Hey, Drew, what's going on? Oh, and there's Angela. What's going on, Angela? Hey, Jay. Jay, thank you very much. I really appreciate that. Really appreciate that. Let's see, check this out right here. Okay, so I had, like I said, this is made possible by friendly donators and sponsors. Look at this. Oh, look at that. My brother and I cooking a steak the other day on the fire pit. You got to check out this Gruntworks Meat Company. Great group, great meat, veteran owned. A portion of the proceeds go to veteran causes, and I'm an Army veteran myself. My brother, whose hand's in the picture, he's a Marine Corps veteran, so this is very close to our hearts and such. So definitely check them out. That's a good way to get high quality beef delivered right to you. This would do for a snack. That'll do for a snack right there, Mariah. That is, had some garlic, rosemary, threw it in unsalted butter, cooked it. It was fantastic. Well, this I think there's different misconceptions around cast iron baking. You can soap is totally fine to use, and that's right off the Lodge website. That's Lodge is the name brand in what you call it, like cast iron cooking. The reason why people don't use soap is it's tradition from back in the time when there was lye in most soap. You don't want to put lye in it. That will mess up the finish. Regular, Dawn or Palmolive or whatever you get at the store now, it doesn't have lye in it, so you're good to go. If you need to use soap, use soap. But I mean, if you want to like be a purist and like, oh, I never want to put soap in it, that's fine. But don't I think some people actually think soap will hurt it, and it won't hurt it. It'll just it actually does a good job of cleaning. No, it doesn't lose a flavor. I mean, that's but like I said, if it's that's kind of your goal is to not do it, then that's totally fine too. But like Lodge themselves says, do it up, soap it up. Yeah, that's the lye's the reason. Now, if you have lye soap, definitely keep that out of it. That'll mess up the finish seasonings. But yeah, you got to do what you got to do. If you want to keep soap out of it, don't do it. That's how the pioneer grandmas did when they had their lye soap. So anywho, it's your pan. You do what you want to. This is America, baby. All right, I'm trying to think if I'm going to do another chapter. Let me see how long this chapter is. I think we could do one more. It's not too. We've only got 61 total. This will be 54. Uh, let's go right to it. Chapter 54. All right. So if you're watching it or thank you very much. I appreciate it. Yeah, if you're subscribed, thank you. And if you're not subscribed, um, I hope that you will if you like classic literature. And this is chapter 53. And let me change this to 54. We're going to 54 here. But all the rest of it is on my playlist, Redneck Jane Austen. And then there's a bunch of other classic literature as well. All right. Okay, so let's get into chapter 54. Chapter 54. As soon as they were gone, Elizabeth walked out to recover her spirits, or in other words, to dwell without interruption on those subjects that must deaden them more. Mr. Darcy's behavior astonished and vexed her. Why, if he came only to be silent, grave, and indifferent, said she, did he come at all? She could settle it in no way that gave her pleasure. He could still be amiable, still pleasing to my uncle and aunt when he was in town, and why not to me? If he fears me, why come hither? If he no longer cares for me, why silent? Teasing, man. I will think no more about him. Her resolution was for a short time involuntarily kept by the approach of her sister, who joined her with a cheerful look, which showed her better satisfied with her visitors than Elizabeth. Where'd my little drink go? I had my little Monster or something. Oh well, I left it out there. Oh well. Where is it? Now, said she, that this first meeting is over, I feel perfectly easy. I know my own strength, and I shall never be embarrassed again by his coming. I'm glad he dines here on Tuesday. It'll then be publicly seen that on both sides we meet only as common and indifferent acquaintances. Yes, very indifferent indeed, said Elizabeth laughingly. Oh, Jane, take care. My dear Lizzie, you cannot think me so weak as to be in danger now. I think you're in very great danger of making him as much in love with you as ever. They did not see the gentleman again till Tuesday, and Mrs. Bennet, in the meanwhile, was given way to all the happy schemes which the good humour and common politeness of Bingley in half an hour's visit had revived. On Tuesday, there was a large party assembled at Longbourn, and the two who were most anxiously expected, to the credit of their punctuality as sportsmen, were in very good time. When they repaired to the dining-room, Elizabeth eagerly watched to see whether Bingley would take the place which, in all their former parties, had belonged to him by her sister. Her prudent mother, occupied by the same ideas, forbore to invite him to sit by herself. On entering the room, he seemed to hesitate, but Jane happened to look round and happened to smile. It was decided. He placed himself by her. Elizabeth, with a triumphant sensation, looked towards his friend. He bore it with noble indifference, and she would have imagined that Bingley had received his sanction to be happy had she not seen his eyes likewise turned towards Darcy with an expression of half-laughing alarm. His behavior to her sister was such during dinner-time as showed an admiration of her, which, though more guarded than formerly, persuaded Elizabeth that if left wholly to himself, Jane's happiness and his own would be speedily secured. Though she dared not depend upon the consequence, she yet received pleasure from observing his behavior. It gave her all the animation that her spirits could boast, for she was in no cheerful humor. Mr. Darcy was almost as far from her as the table could divide him. She was on one side of her mother. She knew how little such a situation would give pleasure to either, or make either appear to advantage. She was not near enough to hear any of their discourse, but she could now but you could see how seldom they spoke to each other and how formal and cold was their manner whenever they did. Her mother's ungraciousness made the sense of what they owed him more painful to Elizabeth's mind, and she would at times have given anything to be privileged to tell him that his kindness was neither unknown nor unfelt by the whole of the family. She was in hopes that the evening would afford some opportunity of bringing them together, that the whole of the visit would not pass away to enter into some more without enabling them to enter into something more of conversation than the mere ceremonious salutation attending his entrance. Anxious and uneasy, the period which passed in the drawing room before the gentleman came was wearisome and dull to a degree that made her almost uncivil. She looked forward to their entrance as the point on which all her chance of pleasure for the evening must depend. "If he does not come to me, then," said she, "I shall give him up forever." The gentleman came, and as she she thought he looked as if he would have answered her hopes. But alas, the ladies had crowded round the table where Miss Bennet was making tea, and Elizabeth pouring out the coffee in so close a confederacy that there was not a single vacancy near her which would admit of a chair. And on the gentleman's approaching, one of the girls moved closer to her than ever and said in a whisper, "The men shan't come and part us, I'm determined. We want none of 'em, do we?" Darcy had walked away to another part of the room. She followed him with her eyes, envied everyone to whom he spoke, had scarcely patience enough to help anybody to coffee, and was then enraged against herself for being so silly. A man who has once been refused, how could I ever be foolish enough to expect a renewal of his love? Is there one among the sex who would not protest against such a weakness as a second proposal to the same woman? There's no indignity so abhorrent to their feelings. She was a little revived, however, by his bringing back his coffee cup himself, and she seized the opportunity of saying, "Is your sister at Pemberley still?" "Yes, she'll remain there till Christmas." "And quite alone? Have all her friends left her?" "Mrs. Annesley's with her. The others have gone to Scarborough these 3 weeks." She could think of nothing more to say, but if he wished to converse with her, he might have better success. He stood by her, however, for some minutes in silence, and at last, on the young lady's whispering to Elizabeth again, he walked away. When the tea things were removed and the card tables placed, the ladies all rose, and Elizabeth was then hoping to be joined by him, and all her views were soon overthrown by seeing him fall victim to her mother's rapacity for whist players, and in a few moments after seated with the rest of the party. She had now lost every expectation of pleasure. They were confined for the evening at different tables, and she had nothing to hope but that his eyes were so often turned towards her side of the room as to make him play as unsuccessfully as herself. Mrs. Bennet had designed to keep the two Netherfield gentlemen to supper, but their carriage was unluckily ordered before any of the others, and she had no opportunity of detaining them. "Well, girls," said she, as soon as they were left to themselves, "what say you to the day? I think everything passed off uncommonly well, I assure you. The dinner was as well dressed as any I ever saw. The venison was roasted to a turn, and everybody said they never saw such a fat haunch. The soup was 50 times better than what we had at the Lucases last week, and even Mr. Darcy acknowledged that the partridges were remarkably well done, and I suppose he has 2 or 3 French cooks at least. And my dear Jane, I never saw you look in greater beauty. Mrs. Long said so too, for I asked her whether you did not. And what did she think? And what do you think she said besides? 'Ah, Miss Bennet, we shall have her at Netherfield at last.' She did indeed. I do think Mrs. Long is as good a creature as ever lived, and her nieces are very pretty behaved girls, and not at all handsome. I like them prodigiously." Mrs. Bennet, in short, was in very great spirits. She had seen enough of Bingley's behavior to Jane to be convinced that she would get him at last, and her expectation of advantage to her family, when in a happy humor, were so far beyond reason that she was quite disappointed at not seeing him there again the next day to make his proposals. "It has been a very agreeable day," said Mrs. Bennet. said Miss Bennet. Sorry. It has been a very agreeable day, said Miss Bennet to Elizabeth. The party seemed so well selected, so suitable one with the other. I hope we may often meet again. Elizabeth smiled. Lizzie, you must not do so. You must not suspect me. It mortifies me. I assure you that I have now learnt to enjoy his conversation as an agreeable and sensible young man without having a wish beyond it. I am perfectly satisfied from what his manners now are that he never had any design of engaging my affection. It's only that he is blessed with greater sweetness of address and a stronger desire of generally pleasing than any other man. You are very cruel, said her sister. You will not let me smile and are provoking me to it every moment. How hard is it in some cases to be believed, and how impossible in others. But why should you wish to persuade me that I feel more than I acknowledge? That is the question which I hardly know how to answer. We all love to instruct, though we can teach only what is not worth knowing. Forgive me, and if you persist in indifference, do not make me your confidant. Okay, so that was chapter 54. Chapter 54. Yeah, they're definitely not as handsome as Jane. Definitely not. Not even close. They're, pretty and behaved though, so that's nice. Yeah, yeah. No, it's like they get better the closer it gets to the end. It's really good stuff. Really good stuff. Yeah, so that's our couple of chapters. So definitely check out the other ones if you haven't yet. And once again, Jay, thank you very much. I really appreciate that. It means a lot. And very helpful. Uh, so yeah, if you haven't subscribed, I hope you'll do it and be on the lookout for my next live. So I plan to be doing it tomorrow. I'm gonna try to get this wrapped up this week, and then really get into Jane Eyre and maybe maybe move on to the next Jane Austen one. I'm not sure if it'll be like Persuasion or Emma. Probably one of those two. So yeah, we'll see. We'll see how it goes. So anyway, y'all have a great one. And Mariah, exactly. She hasn't, but it's coming up very soon. I'm not sure what chapter it is, but it'll be really soon. So yeah, get your little notifications turned on. But I'm gonna try to do like sometime during the day, probably afternoon, and then in the evening. It's kind of what I'm shooting for. So anyway, you all have a great night. Great seeing everybody, and talk to you soon.